Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Our overriding aim must always be to keep the British public safe and to ensure the horrific terrorist attacks, such as the ones at the Fishmongers Hall and in Streatham, cannot be repeated. And we were all shocked and horrified by the attacks and mourn the death of Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones, who were killed on that day. And of course, as has already been mentioned, over the years, we've witnessed so many terrorist attacks, so many lives lost, so much suffering. And it's of course vital that we have a set of policies that ensure that those who commit those atrocities are prosecuted. But we must also make sure that we take action to do the prevention, to deal with the underlying causes, and that there is proper investment in our schools, in our local authorities, in our communities, so that we can ensure young people in particular are protected from the dangers of radicalisation, of being groomed online, of being prey to extremists, whether from religious extremists or far-right extremists. And as we've already heard, there is a growing threat of both kinds, and the mutually reinforcing threat of violent extremism from the far right and the religious right, religious extremists, is going to pose an even greater danger to our society. So it is right, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we on this side support the actions to ensure that sentencing is improved, but that has to come with proper safeguards, as my honourable friends have already highlighted in this debate. And that means that we've got to question why it is that the government has changed lowered the standards of proof for suspected terrorist activity and replaced it with reasonable grounds, which is a relative term, as we've already heard. And we've already heard about some of the risks and dangers of doing that. We've heard about what that could mean in operational terms. And we've seen many of the mistakes can happen despite the valiant efforts of our security services, our police services and other services. Mistakes can happen at the operational level, which is why the checks and balances have to be put in place to ensure we strike the right balance between people's liberty, people who haven't done anything wrong, who may be suspected, and those who are committing crime, that our security services and police have the right legal framework to work within. This particular change is actually not going to make matters better. They are likely to create greater resentment if mistakes are made, which is why I appeal to ministers to reconsider this particular change. In terms of the other major concerns I have, it is that we need to ensure that alongside the sentencing changes and ensuring that there are proper checks and balances, that the government sets as a matter of urgency a deadline for the review of the Prevent strategy, because without action on prevention, we are only going to be dealing with one side of the coin. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know all too well the dangers of Prevent not working. And while I recognise that many of the interventions over the years have had some success, of course, significant success, the review is critical for us in terms of learning the lessons of what doesn't work, what needs to be reformed, what needs to be improved. And the areas where we need to see radical action is around supporting the young and those at risk, and looking at where online threats are and the new threats that are emerging, particularly in terms of the far right. And that is why I hope that the Minister will be able to say today when that review is going to be complete. I recognise that there is a delay, but we need an urgent response, and we need to make sure that we don't have continued delay. Another issue is is really about how we resource our public services. There's a requirement in sections 36 to 41 of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015, which sets out a duty on local authorities and partners to provide support for people vulnerable to being drawn into any form of terrorism. Yet we know that local authorities were already facing cuts. My own local authority has, despite some support from government, is going to face a deficit of about £50 million. And at a time of great pressure, when local authorities have a duty around this agenda, it's really important that they are properly supported. And I hope the Minister will be able to say what additional resources will be provided, and also to schools in terms of providing proper training and support to our teachers, because they're being expected to take action without proper support. And I raised these issues previously after the 3 girls in my constituency from Bethnal Green went to Syria. That was years ago, and I'm not yet convinced that the government has seriously taken on board the need for investment and support in our schools, in our local communities, in our youth services. In fact, youth services have seen a dramatic set of cuts over the years. So I hope the Minister will look at the wider agenda as the review takes place, while I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you, Honourable Lady. As someone who was a former citizenship teacher and a great subject that was introduced under members from the opposition benches, would she concur with me that citizenship at the moment, whilst it is statutory, is not a subject that has to be taught in lesson format, and that it should be given greater on the curriculum in order to help tackle the difficult stuff that the Honourable Lady is mentioning?
I agree, and it's disappointing that the coalition government made those changes. And I think the important thing is that now we look forward and look at how we can make improvements, and that requires the government to focus on not only on being tough on terrorism once an act of terror has happened, but also on the causes. And that does require proper partnership, proper investment, and we have not seen that in recent years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's not difficult for governments, and that can be in the form of all governments, to come forward with tough legislation. That's not difficult. The heavy lifting is in communities, it's in our schools, it's in our youth centres, it's in our places of worship. So that is where we need to redouble our efforts alongside what's happening today, so that we can genuinely work together as a society to prevent terrorism, to prevent extremism of all forms, far-right extremism as well as religious extremism. And that is what's missing. And I hope that ministers will heed our advice and focus on the prevent agenda and get that right, so that other particularly young people, are not at risk like my constituents were, who ultimately ended up leaving the country. And as we all know, it has ended terribly. Thank you.